Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling, well, a really big idea. You know how we usually picture the Renaissance? This amazing European flowering, mostly in Italy, all art and philosophy kind of happening on its own.
That classic image, yeah.
Well, what if that picture is missing a huge part of the story? What if the whole thing was actually built on connections stretching, well, all over the globe?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're exploring today, drawing from Jerry Broughton's book, The Renaissance, a global perspective.
Right.
The book really pushes back against that traditional, very Eurocentric view. It argues the Renaissance wasn't just European, it was a genuinely worldwide thing.
So our mission today is to unpack that, how trade, cultural exchange, even, power struggles across continents shaped this period. We're hoping to find some surprising links and maybe challenge how we think the modern world kicked off.
Absolutely. Should be quite the journey.
Let's dive in. We're starting with a famous painting, Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors from 1533.
Ah, yes, a classic.
And your first impression is probably, wow, these two very elegant, very important looking guys, they're surrounded by all this sophisticated stuff. Lutes, globes, sundials, math tools.
All the markers of Renaissance learning and status.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They look like the perfect image of that modern individual, emerging, self-aware, confident, peak European achievement, right?
But what's really interesting, and what the book uses this painting to show right away, is that even this seemingly purely European scene is hinting at something bigger. Global connections and even, well, a darker side.
Okay, how so?
Well, look closely. See the lute? One string is broken. That suggests discord, maybe disharmony. Then there's a hymn book open to a Lutheran hymn hinting at the religious conflict spreading across Europe. And there's a merchant's arithmetic book, too.
Signaling the rise of global trade and finance.
Precisely. These aren't just random objects. The book argues they're clues. Clues that the Renaissance wasn't just high art and philosophy, but was tangled up with these huge global shifts and the conflicts that came with them.
And you mentioned a darker side. The book doesn't shy away from that.
Not at all. It points out that many of these European advances in culture, science, tech often went hand in hand with things like religious fanaticism, political ignorance, the horrors of slavery, and huge gaps between the rich and poor.
So it's a much more complex, maybe less celebratory picture.
Exactly. A more nuanced global view is crucial.
Okay, so speaking of global connections, let's talk about Venice. A real crossroads, wasn't it?
Absolutely. A gateway between East and West. And there's another painting the book highlights, Giovanni and Gentile Bellini's St. Mark preaching in Alexandria from the early 1500s.
Describe that one for us.
Well, you've got St. Mark preaching, but look at the crowd. It's incredibly diverse. You see Venetian nobles, sure, but also Mamluks, Moors, Ethiopians, Turks, Tatars,
Right.
and even exotic animals. There's a giraffe, a camel. The architecture itself is a mix, like Byzantine domes meet Venetian styles. It's visually stunning.
But the book says it's more than just pretty scenery.
Oh, much more. If you connect it to the bigger picture, it shows Venice's vital role as this commercial hub. European cities depended heavily on cultures in Egypt, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, not just for luxury goods, but for knowledge, for technical skills too.
What kind of goods are we talking about?
Think spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, the stuff that really flavored European food, but also silks, velvets, cottons, gems, rhubarb, Chinese porcelain, sandalwood, even horses, all flowing into Europe from the east.
And that must have really changed European culture, what people wanted, what things looked like.
Absolutely. Even the colors painters used, those rich Eastern dyes, blues, crimsons, reds, they literally transformed the palette of Renaissance art. You see it right there in the Bellini's painting. And it wasn't just paints. Venetian buildings like the Rialto Market or the Doge's Palace actually copied designs from places like Aleppo and Syria.
That's incredible. That level of trade, though, it must have needed new ways of doing business, right? How do they handle the sheer scale of it?
That's a great question. And what's fascinating here is the rise of really sophisticated financial tools. It wasn't just about piling goods onto ships anymore.
So what changed?
Well, a few key things. First, the ships got bigger, much bigger. They could carry over 300 barrels of goods. That's like 3 times what older ships could handle.
Okay, bigger ships, more goods.
But then you needed better ways to track it all, to finance it. So you see the development of modern accounting, like double entry bookkeeping, and things like bills of exchange, basically early versions of checks, and of course, charging interest on loans.
Wait, wasn't charging interest usury banned by the church?
Officially, yes. But the book points out there were significant Arab contributions to these financial tools. Think of Fibonacci bringing Hindu-Arabic numerals 0 through 9 and algebra from the Arabic aljarb into European use. That was huge for calculation.
So global collaboration even in finance.
Definitely. And on the interest point, yeah, the church frowned on usury, but banks found ways around it, and often they worked with Jewish merchants who didn't have the same religious restrictions, so they could handle the lending and interest more freely.
Right, okay. Let's shift gears slightly. We often hear about humanism during the Renaissance. We think of it as, a philosophical thing, rediscovering classical texts.
Right, focused on the individual human potential.
But the book suggests it was maybe more practical than that. Let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah, that's a really important point the book makes. Humanism, pushed by people like Petrarch, wasn't just about intellectual navel-gazing. It was, in many ways, a practical professional education.
How so?
It was about giving people, mostly men, but sometimes women too, the essential skills in rhetoric and language. Why? To prepare them for jobs in the growing governments of these new states, they needed secretaries, lawyers, diplomats, even priests who could write well, argue persuasively, function effectively in the secular world.
So less about abstract philosophy, more about getting a good job in the administration.
In large part, yes. It was about equipping people with the tools to navigate and influence the world around them. That was a big shift from the kind of inward-looking scholarship of the medieval period.
Okay, that makes sense. And this focus on practical skills, on spreading knowledge, it must tie into the biggest technological game changer of the era, right?
Absolutely. You're talking about the printing press.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does. The book details how it was kind of a team effort. Gutenberg first, Schoeffer around 1450 in Mainz, Germany, and this machine just exploded the availability of information.
The numbers are just mind-boggling, aren't they?
They really are. By 1500, maybe 50 years after the invention, something like 15 to 20 million books had been printed. Fast forward to the mid-1500s, and it's up to 150 million.
Wow.
That's more books printed in roughly a century than had been produced by hand in the 1,000 years before that. I mean, just try to picture that shift.
It's almost impossible to grasp the impact. What did that flood of books actually do?
Well, it democratized knowledge, for starters. Information wasn't just for the elite clergy or nobility anymore. It also helped standardize languages, German, French, English, because people were reading the same printed texts. And that, in turn, helped build a new sense of kind of national identity. People started identifying more with others who spoke and read their language, not just with their local lord or their religion.
But the printing press wasn't just spreading secular knowledge or standardizing language, was it? It had a massive impact on religion itself.
Oh, absolutely. This raises a really important question. What happens when this incredibly powerful new tool gets used for religious revolution?
You mean Martin Luther?
Exactly. The book shows how Luther just masterfully used the printing press. Starting around 1517, he flooded Germany with pamphlets arguing against papal indulgences, challenging the Catholic Church's authority, its whole position as the middleman between people and God.
And that basically lit the fuse for the Protestant Reformation.
It did. It spread his ideas like wildfire, far faster and wider than would ever have been possible before print.
So how did the Catholic Church respond to this print-fueled challenge?
With the Counter-Reformation, formally starting with the Council of Trent in 1545, and the book describes this as both spiritual and political. On one hand, yes, they cracked down hard on heresy, banned books, the Index of Forbidden Books.
Right.
But they also fought back with spectacle. They embraced this incredibly grand theatrical art. Think Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling or Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican's Sala di Constantino. It was like using overwhelming visual power to counter the stark printed word coming from the Protestant North.
That's fascinating. Battling print with paint.
And there's a specific example the book highlights that's amazing. In that Sala di Constantino, Raphael painted scenes depicting Emperor Constantine's supposedly donating temporal power over the Western Roman Empire to the Pope. This artwork was being created at the exact same time that Luther and others were using printed pamphlets to prove that the donation of Constantine was actually a centuries-old forgery.
Wow. So a direct clash of ideologies playing out in art versus print.
A really dramatic one. And all this upheaval, religious and political, also fed into the rise of powerful nation-states, France, Spain, Portugal, even the Ottoman Empire. These big players increasingly challenged the church's power in worldly affairs. It was a whole new political map emerging in Europe.
And alongside this changing political map, the actual map of the world was being redrawn too, thanks to exploration.
That's right. For a long time, the standard was Ptolemy's geography, written way back in the 2nd century CE. Even updated editions, like one from 1482, were still based on his work.
But it wasn't really accurate for the world people were starting to discover, was it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Ptolemy's map was sophisticated for its time, geometrically speaking, but it had major errors, especially regarding the size of continents and oceans. It just wasn't useful for the kind of long-distance sea voyages that were beginning.
Who was driving those voyages?
Primarily the Portuguese, initially. They were desperate to find a sea route to Asia, mainly to get access to African gold and Asian spices directly, bypassing the overland routes controlled by the Ottomans and the taxes that came with them.
And how did they navigate these unknown waters?
They relied heavily on new tools and knowledge: astronomical tables, astrolabes, quadrants. Much of this know-how, the book points out, came from Jewish scholars who were experts in mathematics and astronomy. This led to major breakthroughs, like Bartolomé Diaz managing to round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in 1488.
Which proved there was a sea route to the east around Africa.
Exactly. And suddenly, Ptolemy's maps looked very outdated for practical sailing.
Okay, so that sets the stage for Columbus. He had this idea he could reach Asia by sailing west, right? Based on a rather optimistic idea of how big Asia was.
Very optimistic, yes. He drastically underestimated the size of the Earth and overestimated the eastward extent of Asia. But in 1492, sailing for Spain, he bumps into the Americas instead.
And his discovery immediately causes problems back in Europe.
Big time. Diplomatic crises flared up almost instantly. The book mentions the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, where Spain and Portugal basically drew a line on the map and divided the entire non-European world they discovered or would discover between themselves. A pretty clear example of the immediate political fallout.
Just carving up the globe.
Pretty much. And then you have Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, setting out for Spain in 1519. Though Magellan himself died en route, his crew completed the first circumnavigation of the Earth.
Which definitively proved the world was round and, well, huge.
And that there was this massive unexpected landmass, the Americas, and another huge ocean, the Pacific, in the way to Asia by sailing west. It completely solidified this new global geography.
Now, the book mentions something called Afro-Portuguese Ivories. What were those?
Ah, yes. What's fascinating here is that these global encounters weren't just one way. These ivories from the 16th century are these amazing hybrid objects, things like intricate salt cellars, hunting horns. They were carved by skilled African artists in West Africa, but often incorporated European motifs or forms requested by Portuguese traders.
So a real blend of cultures and skills.
Exactly. A tangible piece of evidence showing genuine two-way cultural exchange happening right there on the African coast. It wasn't just Europe imposing its culture outwards.
That's a great example. And you mentioned maps becoming political tools.
Oh, absolutely. Cartographers weren't just neutral scientists. The book gives the example of Diogo Ribeiro, a Portuguese map maker working for Spain. In his 1529 world map, he deliberately placed the incredibly valuable Spice Islands, the Moluccas, just inside the Spanish half of the world, as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Even though their true location was probably debatable, or even in the Portuguese zone.
Precisely. He massaged the map, you could say, to support Spain's economic and political claims. Maps became powerful arguments, tools of empire. It shows how even scientific representations could be shaped by political agendas. Some things never change, do they?
It seems not. But we have to address the fact that this era of exploration and global expansion had an absolutely devastating side.
Yes, we absolutely do. The book is unflinching about this. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas led to a catastrophic collapse of indigenous population.
Mostly due to diseases they had no immunity to.
Primarily, yes. Smallpox, measles, influenza swept through communities with horrifying speed and mortality. But it was also coupled with incredible brutality and exploitation. Think of Cortez conquering the Aztec Empire in Mexico starting in 1519, or Pizarro doing the same to the Inca Empire in Peru just over a decade later.
And this wasn't just conquest, it led to systems of forced labor.
Exactly. Systems like the encomienda in the Spanish colonies amounted to forced labor, stripping people of their land and freedom. And when indigenous populations died off in such huge numbers, the Europeans turned elsewhere for labor.
Which led to the transatlantic slave trade.
Tragically, yes. The book highlights the horrifying beginnings of this trade. Just between 1525 and 1550, an estimated 40,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to work, mainly on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil.
40,000 in just 25 years.
And that was just the beginning. This horrific trade, along with the literal tons of gold and silver plundered from the Americas' wealth that flooded into Europe and caused massive inflation, the so-called price revolution. This directly bankrolled so much of what we admire about the European Renaissance. The art, the architecture, the scientific endeavors.
So this raises a really important and uncomfortable question, doesn't it? The glittering achievements of the Renaissance were built, at least in part, on immense human suffering and exploitation elsewhere in the world.
That's the unavoidable conclusion the book presents. It really challenges any purely celebratory view of the era. You have to see the connections, the costs.
This drive for knowledge, for expansion, even had its own anxieties. You mentioned Christopher Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus earlier.
Right, from around 1592, Faustus sells his soul to the devil for unlimited knowledge, specifically about the cosmos, the motions of the heavenly spheres.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. How does Faustus connect to the broader themes?
Well, Faustus's burning desire for knowledge perfectly mirrors the Renaissance's intense scientific curiosity, that drive to understand the world. But his story's a tragedy. He gets the knowledge, but he's damned. It reflects, I think, some of the deep ethical unease and societal anxiety that came with challenging old certainties and uncovering potentially dangerous truths.
And there were some truly revolutionary scientific truths being uncovered then.
Absolutely. The year 1543 was pivotal. You had two bombshells published. First, Nicholas Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres.
The book that proposed the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system.
Exactly, the heliocentric model. It completely challenged centuries of church-approved cosmology that placed Earth and humanity at the center of everything. A massive shift.
And the second revolution in 1543.
That was Andreas Vesalius's On the Fabric of the Human Body. He revolutionized anatomy. Instead of just relying on ancient Greek texts like Galen, Vesalius performed detailed human dissections himself sometimes. Yes, using bodies acquired through questionable means like body snatching.
A hands-on approach, to say the least.
Definitely grisly, but his incredibly detailed anatomical drawings, based on direct observation, corrected hundreds of errors in the old texts and created a whole new foundation for understanding the human body.
So both Copernicus and Vesalius, in different ways, kind of, dethroned humanity, moved Earth and the human body from this special, divinely ordained central position.
That's a great way to put it. They presented a universe and a body that operated according to natural laws, observable and understandable through reason and investigation, not necessarily just divine decree.
But these weren't just abstract scientific ideas floating around in universities, were they? Did they have practical applications?
Oh, very much so. And often, the book points out, these applications were driven by the demands of trade, exploration, and especially warfare. They were intrinsically linked.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. We already mentioned Luca Pacioli and his work on practical mathematics, including double-entry bookkeeping, absolutely essential for managing the growing complexity of international trade and finance.
Right.
Then you have someone like Niccolo Tartaglia. His book, New Science, from 1537, was all about ballistics, the science of projectile motion, how cannonballs fly. He dedicated it to King Henry VIII of England. Why? Because understanding artillery was becoming crucial for the new style of warfare, for sieges, for naval battles. Military engineering was booming.
So, science serving the military-industrial complex even back then?
You could say that, yeah. And battlefield medicine, too. Ambroise Paré, a French surgeon, published groundbreaking work on surgery in 1545. His advances in treating gunshot wounds and using ligatures instead of cauterization came directly from his brutal experiences treating soldiers during the Franco-Habsburg Wars.
So innovation was really driven by these very real-world, often violent pressures of a competitive global landscape.
Absolutely. And again, it's vital to remember, as the book consistently does, that these advances weren't happening in a purely European vacuum.
Right, you mentioned contributions from elsewhere.
Yes. Arab mathematicians laid crucial groundwork for trigonometry, which European scientists like Regiomontanus built upon for astronomy and navigation. And we talked about Jewish scholars providing essential astronomical data and navigational expertise to the Portuguese explorers. It was a much more interconnected intellectual world than the traditional narrative suggests. What we often label Western science drew heavily on this shared global heritage.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway here? From Holbein's hidden symbols to Venetian trade routes, the printing press, the redrawn maps, the scientific revolutions, and the human cost of it all. This deep dive, based on the book, really changes the picture of the Renaissance, doesn't it?
It fundamentally shifts the perspective. It shows it wasn't just this isolated European rebirth. It was a dynamic, messy, often brutal, but undeniably global phenomenon. Everything was connected: art, trade, religion, technology, science, all woven into these larger global currents of exploration, exploitation, cultural borrowing, and conflict.
It makes you rethink what Renaissance even means.
Exactly. And it leads to a final thought, perhaps. If the Renaissance, this period we often see as the very dawn of the modern Western world, was actually so deeply interconnected, so globally influenced from its very beginnings.
And what does that say about our own modern world today?
Right. What does it imply about how we understand globalization, interdependence, cultural influence now? The past, it seems, was far more tangled and globally connected than we often give it credit for. Maybe our present is just a continuation of that long, complex story. It makes you wonder how we perceive our own connections and divisions today, doesn't it?